Welcome back to Bio 1441. Professor Kerfoot in the biology bunker, here to talk to you about the evolution of vertebrates. Today we're talking about the transition to life on land. We'll look at a couple groups, including the amphibians and the reptiles. Now, just to remind you, last time we mentioned the vertebrates, right? The evolution of vertebrates. We talked about those. We have the gnathostomes, which are those that have jaws. We have the osteichthyons, which are the bony fish, which include us. We have the lobe-finned fish within that group, which includes us. And then the tetrapods, which also includes us. And we're focusing now on those tetrapods this time. Now, one thing I want to point out is as we look at these adaptations to life on land, that's kind of the theme of the lecture here. I'd like to show you that, if we remember where these ancestors came from. Green algae is where plants come from. Crustaceans are where insects come from. And a lobe-finned fish is where tetrapods come from. This shows you some of the characteristics that critters had to develop to survive on land. Remember, land's hard to live on. You have to fight gravity. You have to prevent drying out, and you have to reproduce. We've talked about these themes already in lab, so hopefully you're familiar with some of the consequences of moving on the land. But you're fighting gravity, you have to retain water so you don't dehydrate, and you have to get sperm to egg and exchange gases and things like that. So let's look here. So notice plants had the hardest time. Plants, anchoring structure. Well, these groups don't have that, but they had to derive, they had to evolve new traits, and those were roots. Algae don't have roots, so they're derived in plants. Supporting structure. Well, they're derived in plants too. We had to make lignin, and that strengthens cell walls, and we had to evolve stems. Internal transport. We had to evolve a vascular system. And they don't do muscles, right? Protection against drying out. That's what desiccation means. Plants developed a cuticle, that waxy covering over their cells. And lastly, gas exchange. They had to evolve something new also that algae don't have, stomata for gas exchange. Meanwhile, in crustaceans, as we evolve into insects, all of these things, structural support, that's the exoskeleton, internal transport, muscles, protection against drying out, also the exoskeleton, all that's ancestral. They didn't have to evolve anything new except the tracheal system, the way they get oxygen. Aquatic lobe-fin things like tetrapods going from there to there, what do we have to do? Well, we already had the skeletal system, but we had to modify the fins and the limbs. Internal transport, we already had that. Blood vessels already existed. Muscles and cells, already had that. Protection against desiccation. This is where the new innovation will be when we hit reptiles. That's the amniotic egg and scales, so changing the skin a bit to keep from drying out. Gas exchange, they already had that because a lot of these lobe-finned fish have lungs. So a really interesting diagram to look at and think about, and this would be a great test question. Anyway, so around 365 million years ago, so in the Paleozoic era, we have the invasion of land, and one of the first critters we know that invaded the land is this one here, known as Tiktaalik. And there's a video I want you to watch as part of the course. It's on YouTube. It's called Your Inner Fish, and it talks about this creature here. There are two other videos in the series. There's Your Inner Fish, then there's part 2, which is Your Inner Reptile, and then there's part 3, which is Your Inner Mammal. And I recommend all three, but the first one's the mandatory one, at least for class. I want to ask you about Tiktaalik in the on the exam. Now, Tiktaalik has a flat skull, which is more tetrapod-like than fish-like. It has eyes on top of the skull. So everything in yellow are fish-like qualities. Tetrapod-like qualities. Everything in blue are fish-like. This is a fossil that was found not all that long ago. I mean, it's been like 10, 15 years now, but in recent history, they went up to Canada and they found rocks of the age where they knew the transitional form would be, because they had fossil fish and they had fossil amphibians, and they knew that the transitional form between the two would be somewhere in between the ages of those fossils, and they found it. And that's this organism right here, Tiktaalik. So we can see here there's Tiktaalik, and it has bones in its fins derived from the lobe-finned fish. We have the ulna, radius, and humerus quite defined here, and we can see those same bones in full-on tetrapods that evolve a little bit later. So here we are, Tiktaalik showing up way back here in the Devonian. So early in the Paleozoic era. So tetrapods in general, what defines them? How are they different from lobe-finned fish? Well, they have 4 limbs. They have a neck. Tiktaalik had this too. They have a neck that allows them to turn their head. Fish can't do that. Lobe-finned fish can't do that. They typically have ears that allow them to hear sounds in the air rather than picking up vibrations in the water. So the first group that emerges then, so Tiktaalik was kind of the transitional form between fish and amphibian. So the first group that we still have around today of tetrapods are class Amphibia. So kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, class Amphibia. How are they adapted to land? They have that robust skeleton. They can hear sounds in the air, right? How are they still tied to the water? You've dissected one. You can answer this on your own. So adaptations to life on land, they have legs, right? They can walk. They have lungs. Maybe they're not as well developed as a mammal lung, but they do a good job. They have cutaneous respiration, but their skin often has to be kept moist. So they often secrete mucus to help this out. They have a partially divided heart, which helps prevent oxygenated rich and poor blood from mixing. So a 3-chambered heart in this group. And they have eyelids, something fish don't have. So they can blink to clean their eyes. Since they're out of the water, they need to get the dust off their eyes. They can blink to do that. These are all adaptations to a terrestrial environment. Here's an example of a native amphibian, a salamander called a hellbender. These things get to be like 3 or 4 feet long. They're awesome. I've never seen one in person except dead ones, but I'd love to. They're very rare. We've been destroying too much of their habitat, but they live in the streams in the Ozarks. All right, so you know about amphibians. And now let me point out before I move on that they are still tied to the water. They have moist skin, right? And they have external fertilization, and their eggs must be laid in the water. So they are kind of like ferns and mosses, still dependent on water for sex. But then we move on to the reptiles, the next group that emerges. And they're better adapted to life on land. They have scales, which are very similar to our skin. They're waterproof scales made of keratin, okay? And they have internal fertilization. So sperm and egg meet inside the womb of the female, or inside the female anyway. Now they lay eggs, of course, and those eggs also are waterproof. So reptiles, like birds and mammals, they have a special, super important organ or membrane, probably the better way to put it, known as an amnion. An amnion is a membrane inside the egg that holds fluid around the organism. So you can have a pond inside of the egg instead of laying your egg in the pond. Okay? So it's a sac that holds moisture next to the developing embryo. This is a major adaptation to life on land. Eggs can now be laid on land instead of in the water. This shows up as Pangea is forming in the Paleozoic. The land's drying up. Reptiles evolve this trait which allows them to lay eggs away from the water. Their eggs have leathery shells, which are watertight. They let gas exchange happen, but they don't dry out very easily. They have internal fertilization, so the males have something known as hemipenes, which are kind of like a 2-pronged penis, hence the word hemi, like 2 hemispheres. And they release sperm inside the female. The eggs are fertilized, and then they're laid, typically anyway. And reptiles have thick skins with scales that are watertight that prevent dehydration. Something you would not see in a fish. You wouldn't see the same kind of scales anyway in a fish or in a amphibian. All right, so here is a drawing, drawing of an egg. So there's a shell out here. We have inside the we have several layers here, right? And so the amnion is the layer that holds fluid around the embryo directly. The chorion is you can see that this kind of outer layer here, it's involved with gas exchange. Okay. And then the allantois, which is right here, it's involved in collecting waste. So it's picking up, notice it hooks right into the belly of this embryo. It's collecting waste so the embryo doesn't poison itself, right? And then also in here we have a yolk sac. We have yolk in here, which is food for that embryo. What's really cool is humans have a yolk sac too, but it's vestigial. When we're in the womb, we still have a yolk sac from our egg-laying ancestors, but it doesn't actually have yolk in it. Isn't that awesome? And then here's the egg white, the albumin out here. So I'd like you to be familiar with the extra membranic membranes here, the amnion, chorion, and allantois, and their basic functions, just real basic functions. But remember, this critter is going to be exchanging gases. CO2 is going to need oxygen. Those are coming in and out. We're going to collect waste here. We're going to have gas exchange going on through the shell with the environment. So this little embryo is developing by mitosis and exchanging gases with the environment, and will eventually hatch soon. And it's in a mini pond, which is inside, the liquid inside this cushioning liquid layer inside the amnion. That amnion is that major innovation. We still have an amnion, even though we don't lay eggs anymore. We still have that membrane in us, and it first shows up as the defining feature that separates the reptiles from the amphibians. And so we have eggs that are watertight that can hatch on land, like these snakes hatching out here. And the reptiles are a very diverse group. I just want to point out we have lizards, of course, snakes, turtles. Even though turtles live in the water and crawl out on land, they're not amphibians. They are reptiles. They lay their eggs on land in the beach, right? And the crocodiles, including the American alligator, the crocodilians, I should say, including the American alligator, one that we actually have here in Arkansas. We have a lot of this clade in Arkansas. Here's an example of a Arkansas critter. This is a alligator snapping turtle. I'm sure some of you have heard of them or maybe even seen one. A really neat native species that has a tongue that acts as a fishing lure, basically, to lure in fish, and whack, it'll grab them. You don't want to get your hands anywhere near the front end of that turtle. Here's another native species. This is, I call them fence lizards. I think the native one's actually called a prairie lizard. But here we see these running around all over. The males have a blue belly. I'm sure a lot of you have seen these. And of course, this is a picture I took well, not recently, but a while back. This is Arkansas. This was actually caught in Arkansas. Many of you I know have seen these as well. This is a copperhead, one of our native venomous snakes. We have a lot of this clade around. And another one that you might run into outside is cottonmouth, another venomous snake, a pit viper that we have natively here. Down in southern Arkansas, we found dinosaur footprints. They're not very common, but they have been found here in the state. So Arkansas had dinosaurs, which are a branch of the reptiles, as I know you are familiar. Dinosaurs, if we look at dinosaurs, they are a branch of the reptile group, but we now know that most of them, or a lot of them, were feathered. And a lot of them had bones that were very similar. Look at this chicken down here compared to this dinosaur here, and here's kind of a sort of a transitional form called Archaeopteryx. We can see dinosaur-like bird that still has teeth, right? Still has teeth, still has fingers, and then we have the chicken here, which has lost teeth and now has a beak instead, and its fingers are inside the wing now. We can see that evolution. Here's one of the chickens I used to have on my at my house. Archaeopteryx, a transitional form. We can see some major changes in birds that make them different. Their tails often are shorter, not in all birds, than in the dinosaurs. They have a beak instead of teeth. And I think some of these had hollow bones, but we definitely see hollow bones in the birds as they evolved flight.